had a fantastically busy summer. I thought with all that was going on, we would not have any business, and we wound up breaking records for every month. The last 3 weeks have slowed down a little bit, but now we're looking toward the season, so we know it'll pick back up. In September, we had a program that was in the works, and it got canceled till later in the year. And so this is how we came up with this program. This is our all-star cast is sitting up here at the table.
That means old.
I'm going to introduce them all, but back in June, with the conditions of things the way they were and with the September program getting canceled, I walk the river walk 4 days a week out here. And on June 28th, I wanted to cry. That's how bad it was. There was no birds. There was no fish. There was nothing jumping. It was a dead river. And I've lived within a block of this river all my life. And I've spent much, much time on the river. So as I was walking on the boardwalk and getting a terrible, severe infection, which that's another whole story, but anyway, I thought to myself, this river was the lifeblood of this community. And when people came here, like my dad's family came in 1917, and actually Mom's family came in 1907, the river was why they came, what they lived on. They fished, they swam, everything they did, getting into Stuart even, they came by the river. And how many of them would have believed what they built in the name of construction and a better world for Florida would turn it into what it's become today. But so I said, you know, we need to have a program. There's been a program on what needs to be done. There's been a program on everything. All I really want to say is to the people of Martin County that there was a lot of fun and a lot of livelihoods on this river that people don't even understand today. They go out in their big boats and they go out with the sandbar. And these children that lived here lived in this river. They swam in it, they fished in it. They didn't have boats. If they did have a boat, it was probably a rowboat. So I sent letters out to some of the people that I personally knew lived close to the river and were involved in the river. And we got a fantastic panel. We got Betty Hardwick, Dale Hipson, Corky Hudson, Gloria Cabre, Fike, Spud DeLoach, and John Peterson. And we also have a pretty good wide section of different parts of Martin County and the river. So what we want them to do is stand up and tell us how they enjoyed the river when they were young and what they did on the river. And then at the end of that, we're going to open it and let anybody in the audience that wants to tell what the river means to them, stand up and tell it. So without further ado, I'm going to kick it off over here. And Betty, you want to be the first one?
I had to make a note because I'm getting too old to remember anything. Okay, I can talk, that's for sure. All right, the first thing I can remember here was in 1944. I was 12 years old. That was like 20 years ago, you know. We came down here that summer, and the city dock was, you know, back over that way on what used to be, I guess that was probably First Street?
Yes.
First Street. And Mrs. Callahan lived right there by the city dock. And her grandson, Carl Ulmer, and I were great buddies. And our favorite thing in the world was to run down that road and jump off that dock into the water. The water was beautiful. The bottom was beautiful. And I don't remember how we got out. I don't think there was a ladder. I think we had to walk around or swim around over to the beach and get off of the thing. Then, after I got married, Grace Walton, a lot of you remembers Grace Walton. Grace Pomeroy she was to begin with. her mother and dad lived over on St. Lucie Crescent. And Jim had a boat with a motor on it, which was pretty nice in those days. And I could crank the motor, but Grace could run the boat. So we'd take the 3 kids who were little, but they could swim. Grace couldn't swim. And off the river we'd go hither. I don't remember what we did, just fiddled and diddled around. I look at that and I think, if she'd have fell overboard, I would have never got her or the boat or anything else back, but nothing ever happened to us. Then by the time the 70s came, we got enough money to have a boat. Then life was really sweet because we spent all our time out. Before that, we was on the beach. The beach was always beautiful. But once we got a boat, we could go to the sandbars. The river was beautiful and clean. You didn't have to worry about having a boo-boo and not being able to go in the water. The dogs could run and play. You knew everybody that was on those sandbars. And it was wonderful. And now it's this. That's all I gotta say.
Thank you. Next, we got Dr. Dale Hudson, Hipson.
This is Hipson, that one's Hudson.
And I'm gonna let him sit and talk right there in his chair.
Okay. Good, thank you, hon. I'm sitting, and I'm full of cancer pills, and if the pills don't kill you, the cancer will. But I'll do my damnedest, okay? So bear with me. I've got notes here. And this is interesting. Shirley and I looked for this for a long time. This is the slips that I have for fishing. And it was more fun back then. Like you said, the river was made for, take a look.
You gonna give these to the museum?
I could give them to the museum, right? Anyway, this is September. And September is the height of the snook season, when the dog-faced eels come in to spawn, and the snook wait for the dog-faced eels, and the eels don't have a chance. But we would rig up eelskin rigs. We get 5 pickle skins from Rico Hardware for $1, and we rig them up on a rig. Hook in front, hook in back, and trailer them from a boat. And it was a killer on snook. I've got some notes here, if I can. It says the best day we had snook fishing. Sue, Earl Dyer, and I were fishing. We caught 100 snook, and they weighed 5 pounds apiece, so we had 500 pounds. In the river, right out here in front, most of it from the lighthouse point, in that area, between there and Powell's Diner, all the way up to the point up at Snuck. Anyway, hang in there, folks. North River Shores, thank you. And, but that was a good day, and we would get like 14 cents a pound for them, and I think I had to keep track of how much I made a summer so Dad could take me off his income tax as a dependent. And it came out to be 1,553 pounds of snook. Can you believe that?
No.
In one year, king mackerel, trout, bass, jack, more bass, cobia, and Spanish. I had 2,531 pounds of fish of the summer of '51.
You worked hard there.
I did. I worked hard, but it was a lot of fun, I'll tell you now. It was a blast. But anyway, getting back to the snook. Where's the gal that's gonna ring the bag gavel? Is that
Mary?
you? Mary, are you gonna give me my 5 minutes?
Oh, you talk? Go ahead and talk.
Talk? Okay. Meanwhile, okay, when we snook fishing, you'd be trolling in a little boat, big boat or whatever, and there'd be a hole or a depression in the bottom, and the snook would lay there in the bottom waiting on the eels to pass over. And when they did, they come out of the hole, grab the eel and or your fishing line, and then you'd move on, and there'd be sometimes maybe a dozen boats in the circle. And most of the people would get, it was like a daisy chain. They get in back, get in line. Now, Ed Miller of the flower farms, of the Oodles, he had a speedboat and he couldn't slow it down. He would say, "Look out, boys, here I come." And of course, he went straight through the circle. And he used to get one or two snook. And that was good, but it was so neat. Everybody saw it, gave the other person a chance at a snook, at a run. And that was Ed Miller. And I shouldn't have written these things, okay.
Ed Miller and the Oodles.
I got that, but it was old man Mac. He was, had a boat, inboard boat, and a tiller. He'd have a straw hat on, and he'd pull it over his head and face, and he'd sit back like this, and you'd swear up and down he was going to run you over. And so you moved over and let old man Mac get in the circle. He had it all figured out, and everybody had their chance, and we get in there, get a snook or two, and make the circle. Let's see, the best. Oh, Sue had one to 27 pounds. That was her biggest fish. And, that's probably enough on the snook thing. But the ducks were here. And the bluebills. Have you ever eaten a bluebill? Don't. They're bad. I got a couple of bluebills, and back then, this is a very short story, but good. I read the instructions. You can't shoot them from a sailboat. You can't shoot them from a boat that's being towed, and of course you can't be in a motorboat. So I got the bright idea of I had a little flatty, and I towed my boat upwind of a great big pond of bluebills. And early in the morning, over at Matheson Cove or up the North Fork, they would take off, and by the thousands, and it would deafen the skies, and it was really fantastic. But anyway, I got up ahead of a nice bunch of bluebills sitting there, minding their own business, and I anchored my little boat, and I got in the flatty, which had oars, and I drifted down. I lay down in the bottom of the boat, and I had my shotgun, Grandpa's old double-barrel shotgun, and I drifted up on them, and I raised up, and I got two bluebills, and I was so happy. And I went over and picked them up, and then I was going to row back to my little power boat, which had a Gibbs engine in it there, a gasoline engine. It had it was an inboard, and you could go all day long on a gallon of gas. And that was kind of nice. But anyway, I was rowing back to the mothership, and the damn oarlock popped loose. And that was it. And I couldn't paddle because the wind was too strong. I had that figured out real good. So I had to paddle all the way into North River shores and walk the boat, towing it, and get way up ahead of it to the point, and then paddle out and get ahead of it. And I paddled down to where my boat was anchored, and I made it by that far. Got back to the boat. And anyway, Mom and I cooked up those ducks, and Dad came into the house, and he said, "I know one goddamn thing. We're not going to cook any more ducks in this house." And he was right. Oh, they were terrible. They smelled, they tasted bad.
As bad as they smelled.
Oh, they were bad. So that was my escapade with the bluebills. And apparently they ate clams and oysters and shrimp, whatever they could find. And Cork, where was I? Come on, Cork.
Well, we were shooting bluebills.
Shooting bluebills, yes we were.
who, after they got down and ate fish, they
Were-
taste worse than fish.
You got it, Corky.
It'll drive you out of the house.
Yeah, it was, and they were out front here, and I don't know, the two boys over at Rio, they were always shooting, and we hear this boom, boom, even when I was in school.
Probably the glass boy.
Glass boys,
Yeah.
right, and I don't know how they prepared them, but they did, and they could eat them, or maybe they made fertilizer
Well,
out
they
of
eat
them.
that.
I don't know, but that's all they were worth. But, we had great fun back then. And, of course, there was a lot of clams and oysters in the river then, and that was good. I had a little Boy Scout group with me, and we were on Coconut Point, and we had breakfast, and we had to go back in the water, skinny dipping, of course. We didn't have bathing suits, and no one cared. And we got out there swimming, and I swear there was about 6 manatees, sea cows, got up between us and shore, and they blew and they snorted, and we didn't know if those things ate meat or or vegetables, you know. And we didn't have much, but we wanted to protect it, so we reached down and got clams and threw them and scared them, and they gave us an open path so we could get back to our camp, which was an old camp where the netters had their nets. And let's see. Oh, Ernie Lyons was talking about how clean the water was, and way up the South Fork, it probably was. And some of the there was an east prong and a west prong off the South Fork. And you could get to it by taking Kansas Avenue and going south and then going east at the Wagon Wheel Road. There was a wagon wheel there, road. And of course you can't, now they got a damn turnpike in the way. But and the water was clean. You could see the bottom, and it was great. We would shoot garfish. We were trying to clear the water of these bad garfish because they ate little Brandon bass and everything. We were doing our part. And let's see, an old Bert Pruitt up at the North Fork, he said, "Doc, you should have been here yesterday." That was his standard thing. And he leads you down to the water, and he had a big snook and a big tarpon tied on a rope. They were mostly skin and bones, and they were both about 25 pounds. And he said, "Doc, you should have been here yesterday." And he was a cover. Well, let's see. I think that's about it. But anyhow, it was a wonderful place to grow up in. And happiness was when I had the little 14-foot skiff with the 1 horsepower Briggs & Stratton motor in it. And I could
That was a Gibbs skiff.
Gibbs skiff.
Made in Jacksonville.
In Jacksonville, right.
Beautiful little skiffs.
Oh, they were great. And, but that was happiness when I had that. So, okay, next in line. Okay, hey, I enjoyed it, and the pills didn't quite take over, but they came close. Okay, here you go.
Thank you.
Very good.
Mr. Hudson, I'm not skipping him on purpose. He wants to go last. So next is Gloria.
I'm the
Cabre.
cleanup guy.
Okay.
Now, I came along a lot later than these
All
two.
right. Brag.
Anyway, I grew up in a fishing family. We started fishing with cane poles on the St. Lucie Canal, catching brim. And I learned how to use a reel and rod, and then bass fishing. Then came the river fishing. Growing up, we grew up sort of on Poppleton Creek and back of Fern Hill Cemetery in Casa Terrace. And my father had the mill workshop at the lumber yard build 2 kayaks out of plywood. And my sister and I were always in the creek hitting little baby gators in the head with a paddle because nobody was afraid of little gators back then. And we were told never to go out into the river, never go under the Palm City Road Bridge. Well, of course, you know what happened. When your parents tell you not to, that's the first thing you want to do. So we would go out into the river when it was calm and in the kayaks, and we'd go along shore. It wasn't really clear. I've heard people say, oh, I remember the days when you could see the bottom. Yes, you could see the bottom toward shore with that tannic colored water, but you could see. And we'd take a fishing pole. We were always catching mangrove snapper. We couldn't take a lot of tackle because it was a one-man kayak for each one of us. And then we graduated, we were allowed to use the boat with an outboard motor. And we would go in the river, and we would go over to the Roosevelt Bridge. We were allowed no further than the Roosevelt Bridge. And there were huge power poles on one side of the bridge, way back, like I guess that was late 50s, early 60s. And we would fish around the bottom of these big poles, and God, we'd catch sheep's head, we'd catch huge croaker, and now and then we'd get a snook. And one day we were watching Vernon Chasen's wrecker pulling up a jewfish that somebody had caught.
Johnny May.
Remember that?
Johnny May.
Probably Johnny May.
Anyway, later on, we were allowed further down the river. And we'd go off of Bay Tree Lodge. My father would take us over there first. And there was a hole off of Bay Tree Lodge, and we would always just catch a ton of fish. Mostly croaker. We'd catch jacks. We'd catch a snook now and then. We'd catch snapper. And when the bluefish were running, they would be coming through there, and we'd catch a ton of bluefish. So my memories of the river were mostly with fishing, because it was really good. And it's not too bad now. I mean, I still catch fish in the river. It's not like it used to be, but what is? Nothing's like it used to be. Anyway, I have a little story about Hipson.
That's my son, not me.
No, this is a good one.
Okay. Oh. I didn't know there was one.
One day I was home, and it was on I don't know if it was Saturday or Sunday, and there was the doorbell rang, and I was living on Inlet Harbor Drive down the street from Chi-Chi. And it's Hipson, dripping wet in his clothes, and he said, I went to Chi-Chi's house, nobody's home. He says, I got to use your telephone. And I said, what happened? He says, I caught a tarpon at Hell's Gate, and he pulled me in. He fell out of the boat went across the river, so he came and wanted to use the phone to call Dale to come and bring his boat so he could go and get his little boat.
Wow.
Anyway,
Wow.
yeah. Well, Hell's Gate was a great place, you know.
Oh, yeah, for tarpon.
Oh, it was.
Super spot.
Anyway,
Had the world's record there.
the other story that I have to tell about the river, and my memory of the river, was probably the most outstanding one in my memory. My sister Diana and I decided to run away from home. And we stole the neighbor's boat. And we knew he wouldn't get too mad. It was Bruce Jose, who had Bruce and Harry's restaurant on the corner of US 1 and now Colorado Avenue.
Yeah.
So we were all shook up and mad at our mother. You know how kids are. You know, if you don't get your way, you're going to do something about it and rebel. And so off we went. And it was getting dark, and we're going out Poppleton Creek. And right at the end of the land there where Overlook Drive comes out, Ivan and Olive Taylor lived. And they were out in the yard playing and messing around with their dogs. And we both by then were getting guilty feelings. And we thought, oh no, they're gonna see us. We're never gonna be able to get away. Anyway, we went on across the river, and Miss Harris' school was going on at that time. And there was a caretaker's cottage very close to the river. And Miss Harris School was no longer, it wasn't in operation, but the buildings and all were still there. They had just closed. And the caretaker's house had an old bed in it. Well, we pulled the boat up, covered it with palm fronds so it wouldn't be seen, and had a radio, went in, got on this bed, spent the night, and the next morning we're listening to the radio. And Les Combs was given the news. Well, you can't even begin to imagine our feelings when they said the Cabre girls were lost in the river. And the Coast Guard was coming, the CAP was coming. Well, let me tell you, it was terrible. And we did spend the night, and I don't think we got a lot of sleep. But the rest of the story is embarrassing and incriminating. Young and foolish.
Next, we have Spud DeLoach.
Thank you.
Okay.
My name is Spud DeLoach. I was born and raised in Salerno. I grew up there, and I sat here reminiscing and listening to all of these stories about how beautiful our river was. You can't imagine the beauty of this river. You just cannot imagine. The crossroads out there where the St. Lucie and the Indian come together was next to paradise. Sand bottom, crystal green, clear water. And you could anchor up at any can buoy or channel marker and catch all the fish you wanted. And oysters, clams. The one island up there where the archipelago is off of Sewell's Point had those little pink clams on it. The only island I know of that had those. And you could go up there with a potato rake, and in a few hours you'd have a wash tub full. It was unbelievable. And you could go anywhere in the river and get all the oysters you wanted. And big oysters, beautiful oysters. But getting back to Salerno where I grew up, my favorite hangout was the fish house and the shark house. I stayed at that shark house most of the day, about every day, watching those fellas skin out those sharks and see them process them. And folks, you can't imagine the smell. I was down there. I never wore shoes, and I smelled like the shark house when I got home. And they brought one in there one time. It was so big, but they couldn't put it on the boat. They had to take the engine on the skid there, and the one in the boat to get it up on the dock to gut it out, skin it. It had to be a great white because nothing else that they caught down there compared to that thing. That was the biggest thing I ever saw. But anyway, they only kept the fins, the liver, and the skin at first. And then as they began to process the whole carcass, they put in a plant back there that would grind up the carcass, because the bone, was all nothing but cartilage. It wasn't like our bone. And that would go through a process back there, and it'd go over a steam drum. They had a big steam plant back there and heated that drum, and as that stuff went over that drum, it dried it, and then it came down in sheets and fell into a trough with an auger in it. It ground it up and bagged it for chicken feed. And then out back they had several acres of chicken wire about 2-3 feet off the ground. It's where they laid the fins to dry them. And then after a certain length of time, they were put in a burlap bag and shipped to the Far East for what I have no idea. But they said that people over there eat them for soup or something. But the shark house was there until after the war, and then someone found an artificial liver oil in the place of the regular and put them out of business overnight. And I've written a book about my life in Salerno. My wife has them up front. If you care to look at it as you go out, it tells all about my life down there. And I would go to the fish houses during the season and gut fish for 25 cents a basket, mackerel and bluefish, because the commercial fishermen brought them in there by the thousands of pounds. And that's where I made my Christmas money, because there just weren't any to be made otherwise. And back then, of course, everything was so cheap, and you could buy most anything with just a few dollars. But Salerno was paradise to me. Another little story that I didn't know how to swim, and I was always around boats, and one day I was standing on two gunnels of two row flatties, bailing them out, and the boats began to separate. And I couldn't stop it. I just stood there till it got so far apart, I just fell backwards in the water. My dad happened to see all this, and he come running down there. Well, by the time he got there, I was crawling up that muddy bank, and he says, "You all right?" I said, "Yeah." When he turned around and left, that's the last I saw of him. So from then on, I knew how to swim. But it's amazing the beauty of that river and what it's turned into today. And folks, let me tell you, we're all a part of the problem. Every one of us. When you've got nothing but asphalt and drainage canals, we've got over 40 golf courses in this county. Did you know that? And they're all being sprayed with pesticides, insecticides, and all that runoff is going into the big canals, and big canals are going into our rivers. That's why you're having the problem you got. And another thing, the problem we got is that causeway up here in Junction Beach. That thing should have never been put there, because it's dammed up the river. You got that old seagrass there on the west shore that banks up in those pockets, and that's why it smells up there. They should have never put it there. They left the river open where, like God made it, where it would flush itself out. And it really breaks my heart to see how man has ruined our rivers. But like I say, we're all part of the problem. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And almost last is John Peterson.
My name is John Peterson. I was born in Stuart, but I was raised in Fort Salerno. My mother and dad lived in Salerno, and I have aunt's house up in Stuart, but I was born and raised there on the water. My dad was a commercial fisherman. He was from Norway. He came here in the early 1900s and married my mother. She was from Jessup, Georgia. And they had 4 children. My sister, my oldest sister, is back there waving her hand, and I had 2 older brothers, and I was the baby. But we was raised on the river and on the ocean. Our biggest fishing part of it was on the ocean, where we caught the most fish, mackerel and bluefish. And we also fished a little bit in the river. My dad never was much of a river fisherman, but he did go out once in a while and drag islands. But we used the rivers for a lot of our food. We ate fish about every day, and we go out and pick up oysters, go out and rake for clams. And the rest of the time, when we was in the water, we was in the water all the time, playing down in Salerno in the Manatee Pocket. We were swimming, we'd have to push the shark carcasses out of the way once in a while, but it was still clean and pretty. And our main entertainment, we got to be a certain age up in high school, was skiing over here on Ski Point, right around the corner here from US 1. On the weekends, on Sunday afternoon, I don't know how many boats, and people would be there water skiing. And you could look across the river, like Spud was saying, and you'd see one or two houses scattered all along the woods. And now you look across there, and there's a house on every lot. And the rivers went from beautiful to not worth swimming in. It's been a great life. I've lived all my life here in Martin County, and like I say, the waters was something different. Like Spud, I never saw the bottom too far up the rivers, but they said they could see the bottoms, and I believed them. I never took a boat further than the Manatee Pocket around and went towards Stuart. So I can't really tell you how the rivers looked, because I didn't spend much time on another water skiing over here at Ski Point. And that's about all I've got to say about the waters. I just spent my whole life on them, and it was just part of life back then.
Thank you. Okay, last but not least, Corky said he has 30 minutes, so he can talk as long as he wants.
I got this.
I just think thank you with that.
I didn't get the word. Anyhow, I thought I would become cleanup man, and anything these guys miss, maybe I would pick up. We moved on to the St. Lucie River in about 1937, 38. C.B. Arbogast sold my dad a lot on St. Lucie Estates, which was right on the river. By the 40s, I was in the river every day, me and my friends, and we were about 8 years old, 7, 8 years old. First thing we learned about the river was the 3 kinds of jellyfish. There was only 3 kinds in our life, and one was a cannonball jellyfish. It was a nice handy thing, you hold it in your hand and you throw it like a baseball. You could throw it at each other, it didn't sting you, and it was fun. And sometimes it'd break, that was fun. Then there was a big flower jellyfish about the size of a dinner plate, which had a beautiful white flower right in its middle, and it would kind of fly itself along in the water like that. And we found out they stung a little, but not much, and we could play with them, and it was all right. If it came apart, each part would become a new jellyfish, we were told. Then the third kind was the most beautiful jellyfish we'd ever seen. It was beautiful pink, about the size of a baseball, with 4 feet of tendrils hanging down underneath it, all filled with hypodermic needles that would set you on fire. We learned quickly about the queen jellyfish, and many a time we were running ashore and taking sand and trying to scrub it off of us. I'm skipping through here now to see what is missed. The water was never clear. The locks were finished in 1925, and from then on the fresh water is coming into the river with mud and whatever it carried with it. So if the locks are open, the water was muddy. If the locks were closed, you still had the tannic color from the tannic acid. The biggest problem in those days from the locks draining into the river was hyacinths. The river would be covered with hyacinths. In the South Fork, you couldn't run a boat. It would be from bank to bank, and your boat couldn't even get through. And we finally got rid of the hyacinths I think they poised them and pulled them out and did all kind of things. But they would come into the river, get in the salt water and die, and kind of drift to the shore and rot and smell. So the hyacinths were a big problem, which has been solved. Let's see where I am now. There was very little salient in the river in the 30s and the 40s. The commercial sailboats no longer came here because we had roads and railroads, and there was very little sports sailing, which was regrettable. Clyde Cotant, who you'll remember owned the Stuart Paint and Metal, was a big sailor, and there was a fleet of moths, which were small little wooden sailboats, which were cheap. You could build them yourself, and that's why we had them here and why there was a fleet here, because no one had any money here to buy anything. And but Clyde said that during the war, the boys all went to the service, and the moths just laid around and rotted. I had a 7-foot sail, a rowboat, a little 7-foot rowboat, when we first moved into our home on the river. And I did a lot of things with it. I shot ducks one time with it, as Dale mentioned, and the bluebill duck was no good to eat after it'd been here for about a week. That was tricky though, in a little 7-foot rowboat with a single shotgun shooting ducks. I had one exciting experience. I always wanted to sail, and I had this little rowboat, and I got a bamboo pole and made a mast, took an old awning that was laying around the house and made a sail, and by gosh, I would sail across the river, steering with an oar, and had my coffee can to bail and everything. I was amazed it was working. And a storm came, a big storm, and the sail, actually that awning had pressure, and it pushed the boat forward, but of course, as you push your sailboat forward, the bow tends to decline. And I was sailing myself right under the water, which did happen, and I was going under, and I leaped and grabbed the bamboo pole and threw the whole thing overboard, and slowly bailed out, making sure I didn't tip, and got it about half empty and dropped my bailing can, so then I bailed with my shoes and sailed back. Got the sail back and sailed back, and I was so happy, it was fun. My father had been watching through the binoculars and saw the sail disappear. He called his good friend Walter Johns, who had been a charter skipper in part of his life. He knew boats. He had 2 boats, the Wahoo and the Upa, and they were both Backus boats built in Fort Pierce. Well, he cranked up one of them and came looking for me, and I was out in the river right in front of here. Couldn't find me, and came back and telephoned my father and said, I don't see him anywhere. And so they didn't worry about it, and pretty soon I showed up, so that was okay. Where are we now? By 1942, I had a 14-foot rowboat. It had a 3-horse Briggs & Stratton motor in it, and it was Saturdays to the beach. We went to the Sunrise Inn Beach, which is today called the Bathtub Beach. And the Sunrise Inn had cut a pathway through the mangrove swamp from the river to the ocean and built a wooden sidewalk there, and so we would tie up our little boat there, and me and my buddies would walk over to the beach and spend the day at the Sunrise Inn Beach. There was nobody there. We were the only people in the world as far as that beach was concerned. So we stripped down and swam jaybird until we started getting burned on the places where the sun don't shine that much. So we pulled up bathing suits back on, and on that particular day we waded out on the reef, which goes out on an angle. And we waded out until we're about neck deep and said, heck, this is too hard to walk back on this just swim straight into shore, which we did. And we're dog paddling and swimming in, and it's clear water, a white sand bottom, about 12 feet deep. pretty soon we see these shadows going by. We look and we're in a school of sharks, about 4, 5, 6 foot sharks. And we looked ahead and the water's all black with glass minnows. And these sharks were herding these glass minnows into shore so they could trap them on shore and gobble them up. And we wound up, when we got in shallow enough walking, we were walking through these mass of glass minnows with these sharks in there, and their heads are going up and down as they gobbled up these little minnows. And we made it through them, and nobody got bit. And we thought we'd try to catch a shark, and we'd grab one by the tail when they washed up on the beach. But he'd kick you off, he could shake you off. They were strong. That's what we did in those days. We had, of course, my father required that I mow the lawn every Saturday, and it was a big lawn. So I had my 3 friends bring their mowers, and we mowed that lawn in 30 minutes. There'd be a few 3-inch strips where we missed, but we got the job done and got onto the beach. And those are push mowers. They weren't motorized mowers. Those kinds of push. Some of you older people may remember they actually had mowers that you had to make the blade turn by pushing it forward. And that was fun. There was a war on at that time, and the St. Lucie Inlet was guarded by a Coast Guard cutter. And if you wanted to go in or out of the inlet, even in my little 14-foot boat, you had to go by the Coast Guard boat and sign in or sign out. Tell them who you were and what you were going to do. And I thought that was a lot of fun. And you get offshore and you could load up on Spanish mackerel and bluefish and things like that. I almost never caught a kingfish. I didn't know how to do that. Let's see. There they had regattas in the river. It was motorboats. People weren't caught on to sailing here in those days, in the 30s and the 40s. And the regattas were motorboats, and Bert Kruger, who was one of our kids' heroes, owned a boat called the Miss Stuart. It was probably 35 feet long and a launch. It had a French warplane engine in it from World War I. It was called a Suana-Sueso or some such thing. Does anyone know how to pronounce that?
Hispano-Suizi.
Hispano-Suizi, Dale just told me. And that boat would go like a scalded dog, and Bert would have to run he'd have to stop in the race and let the others catch up with him and get ahead, and then he would go past them, and he won all of the races. We loved Bert because he was a pilot. He had a biplane, and we would watch him do loops and spins and things, and we thought that was wonderful. And I'm told that he was a pilot in World War I. I don't know if that's true, but I suspect he must have been. I got my private flying license in those days as a teenager, as did my good friend Evan Squarey and Jim Harrell. And we would fly over the area and look at things, and flying over the Indian River, you always saw manatees, you saw giant stingrays, and you would see sawfish. There was nothing to see them. And I think they are finding a few sawfish still in the river. I sure hope so. The dog-faced eels, Dale has told you about that. One interesting thing about that dog-faced eels was one Sunday, they were under the Palm City Bridge, and the charter skippers from West Palm, about 4 of them, came down here to fish for these snook in the St. Lucie River. And we had a large circle of boats going around, either clockwise or counterclockwise, one or the other, not both. And they were catching and boating these snook who were feeding on the eels. Today, you can walk where those boats ran, those big, 60-foot sport fishermen were running in plenty of water, which shows how the canal has brought out the muddy water, when it gets into the wide river, it stops flowing so fast, and the mud and sand and silt sink to the bottom, and it is filled in that whole river, where they used to actually run deep draft boats and were catching snook. And this is September. Some of you fishermen get out there, they may still be doing it. Nobody knows. There were big fish in the river in those days. The Goliath grouper, which we used to call a Jewfish, and we always had the Martin County Fishing Guide, which went all over the United States and probably Europe. And on the front of it was a picture of Johnny Mann, who was our fire chief, whom everybody loved. Johnny was in everything. He was just a nice guy. And he's posed in front of a 300-pound Goliath grouper being held up by the town wrecker. And Johnny's got a little teeny casting rod in his hand, which you could hardly catch a 10-pound black bass on. And he's got a big grin on his face. And the joke is, who is going to tie together this 300-pound grouper with this tiny little rod? And that was an inside joke, which I don't think very many people caught up on. Hold on, I'll get the page turned in a minute. I read slow. I wonder who writes this stuff. The commercial fishing in the St. Lucie River. Back in those days, it was seining. The nets were at least 2 miles long. You would see them come down the river, a string of boats. They had a towboat pulling a boat that had a winch in it. I'll call it the winch boat. Behind that, there would probably be 2 or 3 net boats filled with nets. And behind that, about 4 mullet boats, which were empty, big rowboats, which they were going to put the fish in when they caught them. And they would tie one end of the net to a tree on the river's edge. And then they would tow the net boats in a big circle, going almost all the way across the river, and back into a tree about a quarter mile down the river, and tie the winch boat to that tree, and crank up the motor and the winch, and run the wrench, which pulled the pull line, which was a line which was slip-tied to the cork line on the net. The cork line is a top line that has a cork that makes the net float. And as that tow line was pulled in, which the fishermen could never pull all that net in, it was too much. They had to have this winch to do it. And as a tow line pulled in, you had to pull a slip knot to keep it from getting the net line, the cork line, mixed up in with that winch, because then it'd be a mess. And sometimes they let me do that if I happened to be around, and I'd pull a slip knot. I thought I was really doing something. The fishermen were pulling, as the net was brought in, they would take it into their boat, into one of the net boats. I don't know if they took the fish out then or whether they left them in them, but they had a problem with blue crabs. The nets were made of cotton. It was tarred cotton, and those crabs would eat it. Plus, they would get mixed up in the net and tangled up, and they were a mess. The fisherman pulled the net in, and there's a crab all tangled up in the net. Well, he's not going to stop and untangle him and throw him back. He'd take his gloved hand and smash the crab against the bulkhead, and then shake him out into the water. And that's how they got rid of the blue crabs in their net. Well, I would take my little 7-foot boat and pull myself around the cork line until I saw a crab down there, and I'd pull it up, and it'd take me about a minute to undo the crab where he was tangled up, and probably 50 fish would go out underneath. The fishermen never griped at me about it. They certainly should have. And I wound up that day with a bucket of blue crabs to take home to my folks. And I thought, I'm going to go in business. I'm going to sell these crabs. I bet I can get a nickel a piece for them. And so I I'm going to start a business. So I walked with my bucket of crabs. The first house I came to was Mrs. Jack Coleman's house. Jack was the Texaco dealer for Stuart. And so I knocked on the door, and Miss Coleman came to the door, and she was a big woman, very loud, big. And I said, Miss Coleman, I held up, I have these crabs, and I want to. And she said, she opened the door, why, thank you, and grabbed the crabs, bucket, took it in, and slammed the door, and left me standing on the porch. I thought to myself, now I don't even have the bucket that the crabs came in. There were a few guides in the river that took people fishing. I don't remember any of them except Doris Colliker. And Doris and another lady lived together way up South Fork, where the South Fork comes almost to State Highway 76. And they had a fish camp there where they lived. And they would take people fishing and for the black bass and the brim and things. And they did quite well, and there were lovely girls. The big thing I remember about Doris is she had, the only person I know that had a pet armadillo. And she said, if you keep an armadillo in your house, you'll never have a bug to worry about, because that's what the armadillos eat. And I had a house for years that was full of roaches. I really should have gone out and gotten an armadillo, I suppose. Charter boat fishing, how did that get into our town? Well, charter boat fishing is mostly offshore. It came in the guise of Captain Ad Whitaker. That was A.D., Ad Whitaker, and he's been gone many years. He was a squitter from New York. I may be wrong, they may have been oystermen, but I think he was a squitter. He moved to Stuart and settled into Port Sewell, where their house is still there, and that's where the Whitaker boatyard is. And they hand line with squid, tin squid. You can scrape it with your knife, and it makes it real shiny like a piece of silver. And you pull that with a hand line. They fish with hand lines. And you'd get kingfish, and Spanish mackerel, bluefish, and whatever. But they were fishing for the kings mostly. So how did charter fishing start? Well, the tourists were here, and they wanted to go fishing, and no one had anything set up for tourists. There were no boats to rent, and they didn't want to buy a boat. And they discovered Captain Ad and said, can I go fishing with you? And Captain Ad, being a nice guy, said, why, certainly. You just have to help out. So they would fish with him and help pull in the kings and all. And when they left, they were often giving Captain Ad a tip, which made Captain Ad start thinking. And so he took the old hard seats out of his launch, and they're open launches they're fishing out of. Open boats, and he put in a wicker chair with a cushion to make it softer, and started charging a fee. You can go fishing, but you have to pay a fee. So that was okay, and it worked fine. And one day, one of the anglers, that's the guy that's paying the fee to fish, we call them anglers. That angler got a big fish on, and he pulled the rod right out of his hands, and Captain Ad lost his rod. You know, that was a big loss. So Captain Ad said, well, I'll fix that. So the next day, he tied the rod to the chair, the wicker chair. And of course, as you can well imagine, several weeks later, they had an even bigger fish, and the angler got real excited and stood up and dropped the rod. And of course, then the fish gave it a big tug and pulled the whole wicker chair right in the water. So I guess they got that back. The chair probably floated. And so from then on, they tied and nailed the chairs to the bottom of the boat. And that's how this charter business started in Martin County. Captain Ad had 3 sons. 2 were fishermen, and 1 is a boat builder. Captain Jack was the first son, and he fished the hobo. The hobo was always a red boat. Jack owned several hobos, but they're always red, and no one else dared paint their hull red. That was for Jack only. and it was called the Hobo, and it went all around like a hobo would. It was known all over the Caribbean and the Bahamas, and Jack was a good guy to take on a month's fishing tour into the Bahamas or somewhere. He knew everybody and where to go and what to do. Then there was Captain Johnson, who fished the Gannet. And these boats were always Whitaker boats. They were built by their family. And the Gannet is right now in Whitaker's yard, is straight down, stripped, and is sitting there waiting for a buyer. And if any of you rich people want to get a boat with history, the Gannet, the Johnson Whitaker ran, now's your time. All you have to do is you have to pay a modest price for the hull, and then the Whitaker wants you to hire them to rebuild the boat and put it into pristine shape again. That's why they almost give you the hull. But that would be a good boat to buy. Years ago they had the Widgeon, which was a 28-foot Whitaker, one of the smaller Whitakers, and it was caught carrying drugs, and Whitaker bought it back from the authorities, and I wish I'd had the money to buy it, but I didn't. The third son was Curtis, who is still living, and I think Curtis Whitaker is, I think he's 100. Is he 100? Does anyone know? 105? And he's just as sharp as he can be. He goes into the shop almost every day and checks on what's going on. He's a great artist. He's painted thousands of paintings, and his paintings are in many of the stores around town. It'd be good to have one of his paintings. He's a writer. He's written a story of the Whitakers, and a hell of a nice guy, and he's a great guy to lecture. I love listening to him. He knows so much of what's happened in the past. I want to tell you about Captain Von Jordan. He was in the Auxiliary Coast Guard. The Auxiliary Coast Guard, they trained boaters how to boat. They checked their boats to make sure they were safe, and they rescued people who needed rescuing. Von had arthritis in his hips. He was bent over and kind of walked like a crab. He was never more than 4.5 feet tall, and but a hell of a nice guy. And he took the radio. He was a radio guy for the Auxiliary Coast Guard. That radio was with him all the time. He slept with it at his home, and if you called in the middle of the night, it would be there, and he'd wake up, and he would help you. He did some chartering. Had a small boat. He chartered in the river and maybe shallow in the ocean. He liked to tie up an anchor in front of the Bay Tree Lodge and catch weakfish. He had a crowd that liked weakfish, and they stayed at the Pelican Hotel, where they would carry the fish back, and Russell Holloway would cook the fish for them. Russell was one of the best cooks there ever was, and he cooked for Patton, I'm told, in the Army. But anyhow, I ran into Bob one day. I was fishing in the ocean around the inlet, and it had about 8 or 10 little blue runners, which are great live bait for kingfish. And Bob was out there, and I waved to him, and he yelled to me. He said, "Are you catching these runners?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "I can't catch any." And I said, "Well, come on over." And we got together, and we gave him about 4 of our runners. And he went on down to the kingfish hole, which is south of the inlet. And I waited about 30 minutes, and then I went on down. And there he is. He's got 3 big kingfish tails sticking out of his garbage can in the back of his boat. And he's playing another one, going around in circles. He's got another giant head. He caught 4 big fish, so my blue runners did a good job for him. At that time, we had a doctor in town called George Trammell. He was an orthopedic man, a bone guy, one of the nicest, kindest guys you'd ever know. And he took Vaughn in and did his hips, and suddenly Vaughn is 6 feet tall, standing straight up, a totally different person. And to continue the story, we lost George. Some years after that, he was being taught how to do aerobatics in an airplane, and something happened and it crashed and killed him and the instructor pilot. We sure missed George Trammell. Finally, I'm going to talk about Bill Matheson, who any of you who've been here any time remember Bill. Who could forget Bill? Well, he almost drowned right in front of where we are right now. He was in front of the hospital. He had been at High Point talking to one of his friends on a business deal and was coming back to his home, which is on Pendarvis Cove over near the Palm City Bridge. He was running a 30-foot open skiff boat with a big motor on it, and it was a Mako, and which has a short sides. The sides come up not quite to your knee, and if it hits something and goes sideways, it's like being clipped in football. It'll just knock you right out of the boat. Well, Bill hit a sharp wake right in front of the hospital and was thrown out of the boat, which kept going at a high rate of speed in large circles. Bill said finally it came so close he had to dive to try to dodge it, and the skid of the motor caught his shirt tail and tore it. Fortunately, there was a tourist in a hotel or a brewing house right near the hospital which saw this happen. And the tourist knew that it wasn't right. Whatever happened was not right. So he called the U.S. Coast Guard, who got on the radio immediately and called Captain Von Jordan and told him what was going on. Well, Von was backing out of his slip in Fraser Creek with his crew already on board, and they just went out and firewalled that boat and ran around in front of the hospital, and there was Bill floating with a ski mask, a ski belt, and was not quite drowned. I don't know if he was conscious or not, but they managed to get him in the boat, and there was no dock for the hospital, so Von Jordan just ran his boat straight upon it, just ran out upon the beach, and they drug Bill out and carried him into the hospital and managed to save him. It was a day before they would say that Bill was going to live. They said had it been fresh water, he would have drowned. But because it was salt water, somehow the lungs managed to survive and Bill lived. For that reason, the hospital now has a nice dock, because Bill Matheson had a dock built for the hospital so that the next guy that wouldn't have to run up on the beach, they could take it to the dock. And I'm sorry to take so much time, but I've blown my wad.
We actually have the building till about 8:30. I'm going to give you a few minutes. If there's anybody that would like to tell a river story of when they were in the river, or if anybody has a question. Ron?
Yeah, I have a story.
Okay.
You don't have to go back 30 or 40 or, shouldn't, thank you. You don't have to go back to the 30s or the 40s to know the beauty of the river. We moved here in 1979, which is about 37 years ago, and we live about a half mile or a little bit less east of here, right on the river. We had a 200-foot dock when we first moved here, and my children were 10 and 5, respectively, my son and my daughter. They used to go swimming in the river back then, in 1979, 80, 81, and all the ensuing years after that. I remember one time my 6 or 7-year-old daughter came running into the house. Well, we have an apartment building. She came running down the hallway, dripping with water. She says, "Mommy, Mommy, there's something in the river. Danny's really upset about it." So I went out there and she was panicking. I went out there and guess what was in the river? A 5-foot shark. And they had been swimming with their inner tubes up until that point. So needless to say, after that, I didn't let them go in the river by themselves anymore. I would stay right with them. But that was quite an experience. And one other thing I can remember very vividly, one of my tenants went swimming in the river, and it was at nighttime, and I went out there to see what he was doing, and I said, how can you see where you're swimming? And he says, well, look. And he went like that, and it was all green and yellow sparkles. Where, I don't know what they were, electrolytes or something, I don't know what they were, but as he swam, you could see right where his hands were going and his feet were kicking, and it was just like an outline of him. It was just fantastic. The last thing I wanted to say is up until about 5 or 6 years ago, we used to see dolphin in the river all the time. Swimming 10 o'clock in the morning, they'd go to the North Fork, well, it would be that way. And about 4 o'clock, they'd come back this way. Haven't seen them for probably 7 or 8 years. Thank you.
We got just a few more minutes. Is there anybody else that would like to say something? Sure.
Those chairs are very uncomfortable.
I had originally from Brooklyn, and 2 of my uncles came here on a fishing trip in 1957 and fell in love with Jensen Beach. And they decided that they just didn't want to go back to Brooklyn. This was going to be the life they wanted. So one uncle went back on the train, got in the car, and came back. And the following year, my mom and dad and us 3 kids and my grandfather moved down to Jensen. And they needed something to do. Obviously, there wasn't much to do here. It's nothing really. For us, actually, it felt like we got dropped off the planet coming from city life. Go half a block. There was the movie theaters, the big stores, and everything like that. So anyway, they were looking for property, and they found a little fish camp down in Jensen, and they bought what is now a Driftwood Motel. And in fact, one of my uncles worked for Bill Matheson as a plumber, and they all had to have jobs because the motel, 2 uncles owned one side of the motel, and my mom and dad owned the other, which one side I think had 4 or 5 cottages on it, and the other side was just concrete, one concrete shell, and the rest of the units weren't built yet. So they had to all go out and get jobs, and they made a sign. This is not about fishing really, but they made a sign. One uncle was a plumber, so it was held up by plumbing pipes. One uncle was a painter, and he painted the sign. And they went out to the beach and found some driftwood and threw it on the ground under the sign, and that was the driftwood. So anyway, it was all about fishing, swimming, boating. That's what brought them here. Originally they came here because they were promised a fishing trip in a really nice boat. When they got here, supposedly it was broken down, so they were given a paddle boat or a little rowboat, a little motorboat or something like that. But we spent all our time on the river, the ocean, the South Fork. We fished in every possible body of water here. My dad at one time, then they bought the bait box in Jensen, they had that too. And my dad would go to Tarpon Springs and get shrimp, and we had the air raiders, I guess you call it, in the truck. Sometimes that would go bad, and we eat a lot of shrimp, they'd be frozen. So all our whole life has been nothing but being on the river, in the ocean, all of that. And in fact, when we were kids, we had the cane poles, like they were talking about, and they used to throw them underneath one of the units. And not too many years ago, we were putting a new floor in, and when my husband took out the floor, and I looked down, and I go, would you please hand that to me? And it turned out to be the 3 fishing poles, the cane fishing poles we used when we were little kids. So that was a good surprise, and I planned when I finished the office hanging them up. But I got involved 3 years ago with a group called the River Warriors, and that changed my life dramatically. I've been on that river since I was 7 years old, and I really didn't understand what was going on. The Indian River Lagoon is the most biodiverse estuary in North America, and some people don't even know that. And like everybody talks about, the fish that were in there then, the life that was in there then is not what we see now. I remember going with my grandfather in the river with his shrimping net, and we'd catch the shrimp, and we'd walk in the thick, lush seagrass, and I would see seahorses and, everything, crabs, you could see your feet. People say you couldn't, I could see my feet, and it was just unbelievable, the life we had then. We'd be like Huckleberry Finn out there, we'd make rafts and had all kinds of fun. but it's not what it used to be. It has a lot to do with a lot of areas, even in the Kissimmee River. When they took out Bend and straightened that, I thought that was a great idea. Instead of it taking, I think they said 16 months or some long period of time for the water to come down from there, instead it's shot down into days. So you have that going on. You have fertilizers that people are using, especially in summer. There's no need for fertilizer because there's fertilizer in the rain, and it just gets washed into the waterways and, you know, poisons our rivers. But you have agriculture, you have cattle farms, you have the big contributor is the sugar farmers, and they would have backwash into our waters. So we're all a part of what's happening here, and we all have to be a part of doing something about it. This river is not what it was when we got here, when I got here in 1958, and it makes me cry. And I've gone to Washington several times, I've been to DC, you've seen me in the news probably, and it really chokes me up because I know what it was and I see what it is now. And the water is capable of causing Alzheimer's, ALS, and Parkinson's disease. Some people don't know that either. In 2013, you could get have a cut. We had a really bad discharges then. 10 people in Florida died. We had over 200 manatees die, over 80 dolphins. The fish had lesions on it. So the fish at times is not edible, quite honestly. There is, Gail, can you tell me what that is? Do you remember the letters of, there's something in the fish, sometimes they're really not edible. So please, everybody, write your local, state, and federal government. And I just the other day, I met with somebody from Hillary Clinton sent down, we asked both the candidates to send somebody down. Hillary Clinton sent somebody down to talk, and I had an interview with that person at the Central Marina. And then someone came down to the motel and interviewed me. And I just want everybody to, you know, love this water and do something about it. Write and call, whatever it takes to try to make a change. Thank you.
To vacate the building, but quickly, I'll let her speak and then we've got to get out of here.
I just want to close on this note. When we moved here 31 years ago, the first thing I saw when I came to town was I went over the Roosevelt Bridge, and it knocked me out. So gorgeous. I know the river's got trouble. I know it's not what it was. It breaks my heart. But even today, whenever I go over the Roosevelt Bridge and I look at that river, I thank God that I live here.
Every time we drive over the Palm City Bridge and even the new bridge, we go, boy, wouldn't this be a fabulous place to live? It's gorgeous and we have to preserve it. Thank all of you so much. Thank that wonderful